Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speakers for today. We have Marianne Standing, who is the Director of the Center for Health and Community Research and the Secure Island Data Repository at the University of Prince Edward Island. With 20 years of experience in research, analytics, and data infrastructure development, she has dedicated much of her career to advancing the use of administrative data to support research, policy, and decision making. Marianne also has a background in epidemiology, psychology, and applied health research and has worked across federal, provincial, and academic sectors. And we also have Kate Kelly, who is a research scientist at the UPEI Center for Health and Community Research, where she supports and collaborates with researchers using the Secure Island Data Repository. Her work focuses on strengthening research through meaningful public engagement and by integrating principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility within the data landscape. Recently, Kate co-led a project with members of the PEI public that used data to co-create spatial and story maps, supporting equity-informed decision-making for climate adaptation planning. So I will pass it over to Marianne and Kate. You can share your screen, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you today.
Thanks so much, Anna. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today, and also thank you to our friends at Climate Atlantic for the invitation to present at this webinar series. So I'm Marianne Standing, and I'm here with my colleague, Kate Kelly, and today we'll discuss how spatial mapping of health and social data can support equitable climate adaptation, and just as importantly, how mapping decisions shape the stories and the resulting decisions that we make with the data. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq, home of the Mi'kmaq people. And as we talk today about climate change and data, it's important to recognize that equity-informed climate adaptation depends not only on what data we use, but how it's used, interpreted, and shared, particularly when data relates to people and place. Indigenous data sovereignty affirms that data about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their lands must be governed by those communities. And this theme of intentional community-informed decision-making and how data about people and place are used, interpreted, and presented will run throughout our presentation today. So just to situate who we are before we dive right into our project, our team is based at the Center for Health and Community Research at the University of Prince Edward Island. We're a pan-university group that brings researchers, communities, and decision-makers together with the goal of supporting healthier and more equitable communities. We're also home to the Secure Island Data Repository, or CIDR. CIDR provides secure, privacy-compliant access to data for research in Prince Edward Island. CIDR is the newest data platform to join a network of similar platforms across the country, known as Health Data Research Network Canada. There are many organizations providing data services like CIDR's across Canada, and they also work together to support multi-regional and pan-Canadian projects. We also work closely with national organizations such as the Canadian Institute for Health Information, or CIHI, and Statistics Canada. If you're interested in connecting with a data platform in your own province or territory, or in understanding how HDRN Canada can support projects that span multiple regions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help make those connections for you. So on the slide are the values that guide our work at CIDR every day. And they're really not just words on a slide, they shape how we operate. We believe in public engagement, making sure that island residents have a voice in how data are used, and that our work reflects what really matters to the community. We prioritize inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. We recognize that we're still learning and unlearning, and we approach this work with humility and commitment. Our goal is to embed these principles in all aspects of the work that we do, from how we operate as an organization to the ways that we carry out and design our data projects. We also honor Indigenous data sovereignty, recognizing that Indigenous communities have the right to govern their own data. We're committed to supporting community-led data initiatives and to co-developing data governance frameworks with community as a way to action our commitment to reconciliation. We're also committed to community impact, using data in ways that lead to real improvements in people's lives. And really, all of the values I've just talked about, public engagement, inclusion, respect for Indigenous data sovereignty, and next, privacy help make that impact possible. And finally, as I mentioned, we hold privacy at the center of everything we do, ensuring that the trust Islanders place in us is protected at every step. Together, these values guide not only how we manage data, but also how we build relationships, make decisions, and define success. So with that context, I'll turn it now over to Kate to walk you through the project we're here to share today.
Thanks, Marianne, and hi, everyone. So our project started with a simple recognition that climate change affects all of us, but not in the same way. A lot of climate adaptation work focuses on hazards and infrastructure, which is essential to help us understand what's changing and how we can adapt with it. But sometimes this can miss the human side of the story. Our health, social conditions, and even the communities that we live in all shape who is at risk. And the challenge is that we don't always have the right data or tools needed to bring health and social factors into climate adaptation planning. And that gap makes it harder for decision makers to see who is most at risk and develop adaptation strategies that truly support them. Addressing this was a big part of our project. So our goal was to partner with members of the PEI public, along with government decision makers at the municipal and provincial level here in PEI, and community organizations to do three things. Identify locally meaningful health and social indicators that are rooted in lived realities, co-develop clear and accessible equity-focused climate adaptation tools, and build a shared understanding and capacity around the data that we use to create those tools. Ultimately, our priority with this work was to try and make sure that it reflects real experiences and keeps people at the center of climate adaptation planning by co-creating tools that can support equity-informed decision-making. So we chose to map data spatially as a way to turn complex information into something a bit more accessible and useful. As many of you probably know, raw data can be difficult to access and even more difficult to interpret in its raw form. Spatial mapping lets us connect data to place at different scales like neighborhoods or regions and reveal patterns that are not always obvious in a table. So in other words, spatial mapping allows us to take something like this table here at the bottom of your screen and turn it into something like this. So this map is a simple sort of example of what a spatial map can show us. This particular map visualizes population density in PEI. At a glance, we can see where people are distributed across the province and where, for example, where populations are more concentrated as shown by those warmer and dark red kind of colors, and where people are more spread out shown by the shades of green. Even without knowing anything about PEI, one could quickly note where the larger cities or towns might be located and get a sense of how different places relate to one another. More broadly, this is what spatial mapping does best. It takes complex information and turns it into something that's visual and intuitive. It allows decision makers and others to quickly see patterns across communities, things like how people and populations are distributed and how those patterns vary from place to place. And that kind of high-level view is especially useful for climate adaptation, where risks and needs are not evenly experienced across communities. But at the same time, and this is something that we're going to return to often throughout this presentation, is that maps like this are not neutral or objective. They're helpful for understanding a big picture, but that picture is shaped by many choices in creating this map along the way. One of the goals of this project that we are here presenting today was to build shared understanding around those choices that go into building maps like this and to involve people with lived experience in shaping them. So as Marianne mentioned, public engagement is a core value for us and therefore was a core part of this project. This slide shows a quick look at our wonderful team of public partners, researchers, data scientists, and students. And the breadth of lived experience in this group played a significant role in the selection of indicators and co-creation of spatial maps in this project. Okay, so how exactly did we co-create maps with public partners? Throughout the project, we worked closely with members of the PEI public by bringing together a research advisory council that was made up of 8 people with diverse lived experiences associated with climate change here in PEI. Excuse me. And we started the very first meeting with a very simple prompt, just an open floor to tell us about your experiences with climate change in PEI. The conversations that accumulated through this storytelling approach quickly surfaced shared experiences, particularly around Hurricane Fiona, which was such a powerful and real experience of climate change for us here on the East Coast. The stories and reflections that we heard became central to the project, and they directly shaped which indicators that we chose to map, how we analyzed and interpreted them, and the kinds of outputs that we created. Alongside our public partners, we also engaged with community organizations and municipal and provincial decision makers. Because our ultimate goal was to support equity-informed climate adaptation, it was important to us to hear from the people who would hopefully actually use these tools. And this feedback helped us to ensure that the outputs were practical, relevant, and could be responsibly interpreted. So with this, I'll hand things back to Marianne to walk through some of the maps that we co-created and the steps that we took to do that with our public partners.
Okay. So the next part of our presentation takes a closer look at these choices we've been talking about that go into creating maps, and specifically how those decisions shape what we see, what we miss, and ultimately how maps are interpreted and used. So on this slide, which you should see, although it doesn't seem to be quite cycling through, there we go, it's going to start for us now. There we go. Technology is always fun. It's a short video that's going to show a series of maps that were created as part of this project. They go by quickly. You don't need to take in every detail. I just invite you to look at how each map compares and contrasts as they come across your screen. What would you say if I told you that all of these maps are based on the exact same data source? It's household income from the census. These maps are all real and they're all technically correct. But what makes them different are these choices we talk about that get made along the way. For example, how income is measured, how it's categorized, what thresholds are used, and how the data are visually represented. All of these choices matter, as you can see, because depending on how the data are mapped, some communities may appear to be doing well, others may appear to be struggling, and in some cases, areas of need can become invisible. And these mapping decisions have real equity implications. They influence how problems are understood and where attention and resources are directed. So to help show why mapping decisions matter and how they shape what we see, we want to walk through a real-world example. So this slide shows a clip from a 2022 CBC article that mapped household income across PEI using 2021 census data, the same data that we used in our project. The article makes what seems like a pretty straightforward claim. Rural areas have higher household incomes than urban areas in PEI. We're not using this example to critique the article or its author, but just to help illustrate this idea that spatial maps aren't neutral or purely objective, and the importance of being intentional with these choices we talk about and putting equity and decision-making needs at the forefront of making those choices. Or as someone who's looking at a map that you come across, understanding how these types of choices have shaped what you're seeing so that you can use and interpret the data in a more informed way. Contrary to what they say, data usually just doesn't speak for itself. So one of the first decisions in creating a map is choosing how to measure any particular indicator. And when I say indicator, this is a fancy way of saying, the type of issue you're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at income. Income came up repeatedly in our conversations with our public partners as a key factor shaping people's ability to prepare for and respond to climate change. The census provides several ways to measure income, and there isn't a single correct one. Income can be defined at the individual level or the household level, for example, and it can be summarized differently depending on what you're trying to understand. So in this case, CBC used median household income. And what the median is essentially the middle value, the point at which half of the households in an area earn more and half earn less than that value. So it's a very common metric. It's often a useful way to summarize income, but it's still always important to ask whether that specific measure aligns with the question you're trying to answer. So when we spoke with our public partners, their concern wasn't about understanding average or typical income levels in a community. It was specifically about helping people with low incomes with the challenges that they're facing. So a map based on median income can sometimes make it difficult to see where low income households are concentrated, particularly in communities that might appear relatively well off overall. Looking at a map like the one in the CBC article, it could be easy to start making assumptions about where vulnerability exists on PEI. And I hope that this next example we'll walk through shows why some of those assumptions could be misleading. So to highlight the importance of this, we've created two hypothetical communities here. Both have a median household income of $50,000, but the reality of these communities are not the same. So in community one that you see at the top of your screen, most households are making somewhere around $50,000 a year. Some a little more, some a little less. But in this case, the median gives a pretty reasonable picture of what a typical household looks like in that community. But when you look at community two, which is shown in the bottom half of your screen, half of the households are making around $10,000 a year, less than what we'd say is maybe the low income threshold, which is just for illustration highlighted by that vertical line on the bar there. And 50%, the other half, are making more like $90,000 a year. So the median for these two communities might be the same, but it doesn't reflect lived reality in every case. And so why is this important? If you were looking at these communities on a map, they would appear identical, even though they would experience climate hazards or face barriers to climate adaptation in very different ways. So because what we heard from our public partners was the importance of focusing on low-income households, we knew that using median income wasn't the best choice, because as you've seen, it can make people most at risk invisible on the map. So instead, through discussions with our public partners, we explored different ways of measuring low income and thought carefully about where thresholds should sit. They emphasized that many people experience financial strain even when they earn above some of the traditional low income cutoffs, especially with the rising cost of living. We selected the one that best fit the context of our work, which was largely around recovery from severe weather events like Hurricane Fiona. And though we use this indicator in the tools we'll show later, it's important to remember that no single income map can be used for every decision. For example, identifying who might struggle to restock their fridge after a long power outage and their food is spoiled, that's a very different decision from identifying where people might not be able to afford to install an expensive home cooling system to cope with increasing heat events. So each of these decisions requires a slightly different lens and potentially a different indicator. And so this is why being intentional about how indicators are selected and measured, both when creating maps and when interpreting them, is so important. The way an indicator is defined shapes what the data highlights, and just as importantly, what it might hide. So when you look at a map, it's worth asking, what measure is being used, and is it the right one for the decision I need to make today? So median income is a common and reasonable choice in lots of situations, but it is still a choice. And in some situations, it can obscure meaningful differences between communities. Every measure highlights some realities and it misses others. So no one map can give you the full picture on its own. Returning to that CDC map, the decisions behind the map weren't intended to mislead. We're not saying that, but it was designed for a specific purpose. And so you just need to be cautious about using a map created for one question to answer another. And that starts with understanding how the data was handled in its creation. So after choosing an indicator and how we measure it, another key decision is how the data are shown geographically. So essentially where the boundary lines are drawn on the map you're looking at. Unfortunately, these decisions are often limited by the way that the data is collected or from the source of the data that you're going to. So this slide shows two geographic levels available through the Statistics Canada census. So the first is a slightly larger area, which you see on that full map of PEI. But when you look at that zoomed in circle inset, that's showing a different, smaller level of geography. So in this case, the area we're zooming in on is Charlottetown, which is shown all in yellow on the larger map, which is the lowest income category on the map legend. But it's broken down into more detail in the pop out. So in our project, we chose to create maps at the census subdivision level, which is this larger area you see in the map on your screen. But this is not an easy choice. You need to weigh a lot of things, including risks to privacy. The smaller you get, with your geographical boundaries on a map, or also potentially stigmatizing small communities and other important limitations. When we map data at a larger scale, an entire city can be placed into a single category that doesn't reflect the diversity within it. And we can see this when we look at Charlottetown, where income varies significantly across city neighborhoods. Next slide. Okay. So here is another example of this concept, this time showing a very large, recently amalgamated municipality in PEI called Three Rivers. We can see at the largest census, or at the larger census subdivision level, that all of Three Rivers shows as yellow, which is, again, the lowest income category on the map. But when you zoom in, the lowest income category is really only showing up in a few small specific areas within Three Rivers. So in that pop out, those few smaller areas that you see in yellow. So using the larger boundaries sometimes hides the specific areas that might need to be prioritized when, for example, you're responding after a severe weather event like a hurricane. This is a really hard decision to make, and no matter what you choose, there's going to be limitations, certainly. It's always a bit of a trade-off between accuracy of data if you're estimating, privacy and stigma, but with also, having that more granular look to try to understand where needs might be across a community. Whatever is chosen, what's really important is to recognize it and think about how it might be impacting the map that you're seeing. And so this last mapping decision we want to discuss today is how data are grouped into color categories, which can also significantly change the story a map appears to show. So there's different methods for doing this. And as you can see with these two maps, different methods can have a significant impact. These maps look very different, but again, it is based on the same data. Some methods are best when you want to know relative ranking of communities. So maybe what you need to know is just the communities that are most at risk, regardless of how different they are from each other. We just kind of need to prioritize. Sometimes there's methods you use that are better suited to identify areas that are significantly different than average. So what you really need to know is, are there communities that really stand out in a certain way? There's methods of grouping the data that are better suited to that. And when you're creating a map, it's important for data scientists to choose the method that best reflects the decision-making needs. But this is a bit of a technical discussion that could honestly be a whole course on its own. So rather than go into a lot of detail about these different methods and how they're done, instead I'll provide some useful tips to show you what to pay attention to when you're looking at a map to help you think critically about it and make sense of what you're looking at. So this first thing might seem a little bit obvious, but really take time to look carefully at the legend. So what do the colors on that map actually mean? How broad are the categories and how different are they from each other? And are they meaningful to you with respect to the decision that you're trying to make? Next slide, please. So unfortunately, sometimes that can be hard to do. And an example is in this article, where the legend's just shown using a continuous color gradient with only the minimum and the maximum values indicated. So it's not really easy to see what any particular color means, and that can make interpretation harder. One thing that does help in this situation in these maps, thankfully, is that you're able to go in, click in on different areas and see what the actual value is. So that can help you with the interpretation if a feature like that is available, but it's not ideal. It's harder to make sense of what you're looking at and seeing it kind of at a glance without a more detailed legend, as opposed to having to go in and click. But that is something that sometimes you can do. And it's a feature we've also built into our tools that we'll show you a little bit later today to help with that. Before we move into talking about these tools, it's just important to pause and talk about Indigenous data sovereignty. In many ways, it relates to what we've been discussing today in terms of context and real-world impacts of mapping decisions. So in the CDC article, one of the communities highlighted was a First Nations community in PEI. And while the article framed this example positively, it lacked critical context, specifically context provided from the perspective and knowledge of that community. And this could lead to unintentional harm. And the issue isn't whether data is presented as positive or negative, it's whether data is handled with Indigenous governance and the context needed to understand what it actually means for the community itself. From an Indigenous data sovereignty perspective, this is deeply problematic. And so as an example with First Nations communities, they have the right to own, control, access, and possess their data. These are known as OPAP principles, and you can learn more about these at the link provided on our slide. So OPAP's not just a best practice, it's an assertion of jurisdiction and self-determination. For our project, we did not map any data from First Nations communities in PEI, and this was a deliberate decision. These data are not ours to share and interpret. Even when framed positively, they could misrepresent lived realities, reinforce colonial data practices, or influence decisions that affect communities without their involvement. Indigenous data sovereignty more broadly is foundational to ethical climate adaptation work.
So neither data nor the tools that we build from them are truly objective, given all of these different choices that go into creating these types of outputs. Creating spatial maps is partly an art. It requires deep reflection and transparency with the goal of hopefully creating something that's useful and relevant to the decision at hand. People often quote British economist Ronald Coase, who famously said that if you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything. This is not to say that maps or data lie, rather that the message we want to convey is that there are many reasonable decisions that we make while creating outputs like maps, and each of those decisions can lead to different yet internally valid stories or interpretations. But understanding those decisions is essential to interpreting a map responsibly. And again, to be clear, our goal isn't to single out that CBC article or any other one example. These kinds of choices are routine in spatial mapping. And unless we're transparent about the limitations and trade-offs behind those choices, they can quietly shape interpretations in ways that maybe we don't intend. Being transparent about the technical details that we've been talking about doesn't just mean making them available somewhere, like tucked into an appendix or put onto a map output. Often, even when those details are technically there, they aren't always accessible. Sometimes they're filled with jargon or written in a way that users can't easily understand. So in other words, transparency isn't just about sharing information, it's about making sure that that information is usable and actionable. Around the time that we were preparing slides for this webinar, I was watching the NFL AFC Championship game with my family. And in the third quarter, hours into the game, my sister-in-law turned to us and admitted, "I don't actually understand football at all." And without missing a beat, my husband unlocked it for her. He said, "The orange team has 4 chances to move the ball 10 yards to that yellow line. Do you see where it says 1st and 10 at the bottom of that screen? That just means it's their first time trying and they have 10 yards to go." Suddenly, she was able to follow the game and questions started pouring out. And as a result, she was much more engaged in the Super Bowl just this past weekend. In a funny way, spatial maps work in a similar way. If users understand just 3 basics, so what is being measured and where, how values are grouped, and what the limitations are, they can interpret maps much more confidently. As we worked with our public partners in this project, it became clear that this type of capacity building really needed to be built into the tools themselves. So rather than relying on technical documentation, we embedded plain language explanations directly into our outputs, things like on clear legends and short descriptions, so that users could make sense of what they're seeing without needing to be mapping experts. So the last part of our presentation will give you a high-level overview of the tools that we co-created through this whole process and how they can be applied to climate adaptation decision-making. The first on the left side here is an interactive mapping tool that we built using ArcGIS Experience that allows users to toggle through all of the indicators and on the maps that we created. The second on the right side here is a story map that focused on the stories around Hurricane Fiona, and it aimed to embed the spatial maps that we co-created in context through storytelling, photos, and other media through a social and health lens. Both of these tools are now publicly available on our website, and there's a QR code here, and I believe a link will be posted in the chat, which will take you to the landing page for this project, but there'll also be QR codes and links specifically to these tools. So I'm going to turn things back to Marianne now to give a short demo and application of the mapping tool.
Thanks, Kate. So this is a bit of a snip of our online tool, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of a tour to orient you to it. So on the left is the map viewer screen that shows the map of PEI. And the box on the bottom right shows a list of indicators that you can toggle between to generate different maps. When a map is generated, a legend that includes a clear description of the indicator. So that first thing we talked about, how are we actually measuring this indicator? That is showing up on the top right-hand side in that legend, along with a clear indication of what those colors mean. So another feature is that users can zoom into specific communities and click on them to see detailed information related to the selected indicator. including the specific value for any given area on the map to help with the interpretation. And one thing that we found is really important through this project, in some work that we did, I mean, we don't have time to talk about it all, but we did this interesting interactive art exhibit where we were kind of trying to find more accessible ways for people to interact with data. And we had an income map displayed where people were able to just kind of write their reflections and reactions to seeing the data. And one common theme that became really clear is people really, when they look at a map, the first thing they want to do is find themselves in the map, and they want to go to their community and orient themselves. And so we thought it was really important to be able to kind of zoom in and orient to place names, and also to be able to see specific data for your community. So that's something else that we built into this tool as well. And then we're going to kind of zoom back out again. And you can see down below the map, on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, there's a section on how to interpret the map and where you can learn more about the data that's used. So these are all plain language explanations and descriptions with links to additional sources. What Kate was mentioning earlier about, trying to make football more accessible to her sister-in-law, we're trying to make these maps more accessible for the people who are looking at them. And so here's just a bit of a close-up of the description of some of the data and map interpretation sections. So we've got plain language explanations of some of the methods we use, like how we created the data breaks, so that people can better understand how the map should be interpreted and what the limitations might be. We've talked a lot about these limitations today. And one thing I just really want to highlight is that our goal here was not to frame maps as problematic. We really just want to build understanding and how to consider the implications of how the maps were created, and make a more informed decisions by taking these considerations into account. So we want to make these tools accessible and meaningful for people so that they can make better informed decisions at the end of the day. And so next, just to kind of give an example of how a tool like this can support real world decision making, we're going to walk through a hypothetical example, but based on a real event, so Hurricane Fiona. We're not using the maps to predict exactly what's going to happen in a scenario like this, but rather we're using these maps to help anticipate where the needs might be greater, what the needs even are in any area, and plan supports more equitably. And this is just one example of how a tool like this could be used. So how could we use it? So perhaps you're working from a provincial perspective. So, you're working for a government department or an organization that's got kind of a broad geographic scope. How could this tool be useful? Well, your question is likely going to be, where do I deploy limited resources first? Things like supplies, shelters, generators, mobile health supports, other types of help. So these maps can show indicators as percentages of the local population. And that's how we've done it, not just counts. So we can compare communities of very different sizes fairly to show which communities might be disproportionately impacted. The percentages help highlight where vulnerability is more concentrated relative to population. So for example, a smaller community with a high share of seniors or people living alone may face a greater per capita risk during prolonged outages. Counts still do matter for logistics. You really do need to kind of take both of these things into account. You need to understand both where a lot of people are living, but also areas that are kind of disproportionately hit, because they're both important aspects of risk. So again, we've said before, sometimes these things are an art and not a science. It's important to just look at this from a lot of different angles to help make decisions that are equity informed and climate adaptation planning. Slide, Kate. So now let's shift to the perspective of a small rural municipality, maybe, or an organization that's really dedicated to a smaller area. So, if your concern is, just a small area within, say, PEI, you may not be using the map to decide where to send resources. You may not even have data that's more detailed than just this one area that you're looking at. Instead, what you could use the map for is to understand what kind of needs are likely to arise locally. And you can compare what your community looks like to others just to help put it into context a little bit. So where are needs higher, when you kind of look at your community as opposed to communities across the province? So for example, if your community had a higher percentage of seniors or people who are living alone, that might signal a greater need for wellness checks or transportation support or accessible communication during outages. These maps can also be really useful in identifying blind spots. So I think as Kate kind of quickly mentioned earlier, we did do some engagement with different municipalities and groups that might use these tools to kind of help understand how to make them useful. But while we were doing that, I sat down with a small rural municipality and we were looking at the maps and the data. And they had some surprises. So for example, like a lot of the efforts in their community in general, not just related to climate change, have been geared towards seniors. And of course, that's something that's really important. And they certainly did have, seniors in their area that needed support. But what they didn't realize until they looked at the map was that they actually had a high percentage of single parent households in their community. So this may have helped identify a group with unique needs that hadn't been considered before. And this kind of thing can be helpful in terms of understanding who may need support and planning around that. But it's also important to be clear about limits of what these maps can and can't do. So they can't identify specific individuals at risk. They really are just meant to complement local knowledge from staff, first responders, and community organizations. They're just another piece of the puzzle. They're not the be all and end all, but they're different pieces of information that you can take into account and make ethically informed decisions. And that's a good segue into our story map, our other tool that we created with our public partners, because numbers alone don't capture what these experiences actually feel like day to day. I'll turn it back to you.
So as mentioned, the maps in our mapping tool were shaped by the stories that we heard from our public partners, but we had a realization kind of midway through this project that although although they were based on stories and real lived realities and experiences, once those maps were created and published, they really lost that lived context and those rich stories from which they came. So the story map tool emerged actually pretty organically throughout this project as a way to reconnect data to real experiences, using Hurricane Fiona as the example. And it provides perspectives through that health and social lens on the disproportionate impacts of something like Hurricane Fiona on PEI. So the tool was built to be quite interactive, again, using ArcGIS. So I do highly encourage you to check it out and sort of see how it's intended to be used, but I will show some screenshots of what it looks like. One feature that we co-created to make the story map more relatable was a set of fictional personas. So these aren't real people, but they're grounded in real stories that we heard from our public partners and supported by evidence and media reporting to make this story map more relatable. And the personas help to translate abstract indicators, things like living alone or having low income, into scenarios that decision makers and others can picture when planning supports. We then paired the personas with examples from real media coverage to show that these challenges are not hypothetical and that they do reflect real experiences that some PEI residents experienced during Fiona. Overall, the story map is meant to complement the interactive mapping tool. So where the spatial maps can show the patterns, the story map helps to explain what those patterns can mean in practice so that climate adaptation planning can stay grounded in lived realities. So as we wrap up, we want to highlight that, although mapping is a powerful way to support equity-informed climate decisions, it does come with real responsibility. Equitable decision-making depends on transparent data practices and attention to lived realities. As we've mentioned a few times, no single map can answer every question. Maps are simply lenses, and understanding the lens that you're using is critical to making more informed and equitable decisions. And so just real quick, although this project has wrapped up, we're already looking ahead. So we're interested in updating these maps and these tools with the 2026 census data when it comes up. And we are continuing to work collaboratively with communities and decision makers here in PEI. One thing that we had hoped to do in this project was to map indicators related to health conditions, but unfortunately we were not able to gain access to a key data set in time. But this does remain a priority for future work and building from learnings in this project. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Thanks so much, everyone, and thank you again to Climate Atlantic for the invitation to be here. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate and Marianne. That was a super interesting presentation and really, really great to hear about all of the work that you've done. So appreciate all the work you put into that presentation and that project.